I wake up in my bedroom, the morning light barely filtering through the curtains, casting faint golden hues across the floor. My husband is not beside me. As usual, he's already at work. I glance at his pillow. Its scent is gone. I don't even know when it faded. But the emptiness remains. I lie there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creaking. Everything is familiar, yet something is off. I feel as though the silence is pulling something bigger than just a typical morning with it. Suddenly a sound. A thud. I quickly get up, throw on my robe, and head to the kitchen, thinking one of the kids must have dropped something, as usual. But as I enter, I notice the broken pieces of a plate scattered on the floor. I stop, silent. For some reason, it frightens me. This isn't just a mess. It's as though it's confirming that something has gone wrong. The plate, it feels like it symbolizes something more than just an accident. Sometimes you don't realize how life slips past you, and then here it is. This moment. This emptiness. This strange silence. My husband isn't here. That's normal. I pick up the shards, sweep them into the trash, but I sense that this isn't just any ordinary morning for me. I can't calm myself. Every morning is the same. Over and over, I return to the same familiar life, and it scares me. It scares me that there's nothing new. I continue cleaning, but this time I'm not alone. Jason appears in the doorway. He stands silently, holding a cup of coffee, as though he's always been here, as though nothing has changed. It's strange. It's as if our family has everything, but there's nothing real. And here he is, Jason, my stepson. His gaze isn't so much concerned as it is calm. He notices the broken plate and asks, "Want me to help?" I nod, smiling, but something feels off. Why does his presence suddenly feel so unsettling? It's just a morning, and it's just Jason, but his look seems too understanding. Jason starts picking up the shards, his movements sure and swift, as if he's done this 1,000 times. There's something in his calmness that makes me freeze. In his eyes, there's a maturity that I lack. I look at him and realize that he is no longer the teenager I once knew. He's become an adult. And maybe that's frightening. While he gathers the shards, I return to my usual tasks, preparing breakfast as I always do. But this time, I feel somehow separate. There's something in the air that makes his presence more significant. He sits at the table, silently drinking his coffee while I'm lost in my thoughts. It's that strange feeling when you realize that everything you've done up until now wasn't just routine. It was habit. And maybe I can't just continue down this path anymore. My husband isn't here. His seat at the table is empty. And suddenly I feel that I don't like this emptiness. All the morning rituals, these mechanical movements, they reveal the abyss I live in. I slow down for a second, and the sense of disconnection becomes almost tangible. But I can't stay in this state for long. I need to keep going. I need to do everything the way I always have. When my daughter Anna arrives for breakfast, her silence engulfs the space. She's always like this. Tired, as if the world doesn't interest her. Her face, as always, expresses absolute indifference. We sit, silent, and despite the fact that we're together, an invisible chasm stretches between us. Jason notices the empty spot where my husband used to sit. Casually, he says, "I guess breakfast is just the two of us now, huh?" His words hit the mark somehow. There's no pity, no reproach in his eyes, only a strange understanding that this seat was once occupied by someone else, and now it's just us, the ones who are left. I try to hide my awkwardness behind a usual smile, but Jason doesn't look away. He continues drinking his coffee as if nothing unusual is happening, but his gaze pierces through me, pulling out something hidden. I can't quite grasp what it is, but this unsettling feeling, as if someone is studying me, only grows stronger. "Want me to help?" he repeats, just like he did in the morning. And again, I say everything is fine, but this time I'm not so sure. His question sounds like he knows something I can't understand. He isn't just offering help, he's almost forcing me to admit that I'm not managing. It's strange, even in the simplest words. There's something significant, something I can't ignore. I see him stand up and begin to help me. But this isn't just assistance. He moves like an adult with an innate confidence, and I feel his presence in the house taking on new shades. It was always there, but now I begin to perceive him differently. He's no longer just the guy who was around. Now, he's a part of this house, a part of this world. And for some reason, I don't like how this feels. I see how his movements become smooth and assured, as if he's not just helping, he's showing how things should be. And suddenly, it seems like I've long since stopped noticing how he's grown. My routine continues, but within its familiar structure, something new appears. Jason sits at the table, drinking his coffee slowly, and his gaze, casually thrown in my direction, seems to pull me out of my own thoughts. I return to cooking. I move around the house again, but every glance he gives makes these actions feel suddenly unreal. I feel strange that I can no longer simply ignore his presence. This house, my life, everything now seems somehow alien. He continues to watch me, but remains silent. And I feel how the silence becomes more and more palpable with each passing moment, as if something invisible is looming between us. Why do I feel his gaze so sharply? Why has it suddenly become so important? I don't want to think about it, but his gaze makes me stop and feel that something is changing. The silence at the table grows louder. I try not to pay attention to how Jason sits, calmly drinking his coffee, but there's something in this position that unsettles me. Maybe it's just my own internal discomfort. I'm not used to his attention. But for the past few days, I've felt his gaze lingering on me, as if he sees in me not just the woman he's known since childhood, but someone else. Someone who interests him now. And that scares me. I step back to the stove, continuing to prepare breakfast for Anna, who, as always, sits with her head down, lost in her thoughts. Silent. I don't know what she's thinking, but it feels as though this silent distance between us is growing with each passing day. We are like two strangers who, for some reason, continue sitting at the same table. Jason notices the empty spot where my husband used to sit. He mentions it with a sort of indifference, as if he hasn't fully grasped how his words are affecting my emotions. His phrase, "Now it's just the two of us," refuses to leave me. I don't know why, but I feel as though he's somehow emphasizing this emptiness. It's as though he's hinting that the chasm between my husband and me is not just the loss of a familiar order, but something that can't be ignored. I look at him, trying to regain a sense of familiarity, but it's no use. Too much is changing, and it feels like I can't control it. My life, these familiar, almost automatic actions, they all suddenly seem absurd. I notice how Jason silently observes me, as if he understands that I can no longer be just a wife and mother. I can't keep playing that role if I don't feel like I'm a part of this life. I can't just be the functional part of a machine that's long since stopped giving me the chance to be myself. It becomes hard to breathe. This house, this breakfast, all these habitual tasks, they suddenly lose their meaning. I feel something large and undefined beginning to grow inside me. It's not just longing, not just tiredness. It's a feeling that I've lost myself. I've lost myself in the cares and duties. I've lost myself in the empty days that pass like shadows, leaving nothing behind. And sitting at this table, I begin to realize that perhaps I've been trying to be everything for everyone for far too long. I've lived by others' standards for too long, playing the roles of mother, wife, housekeeper. But who will take care of me? Who will understand that I need more than just fulfilling my obligations? With that thought, I realize for the first time that maybe it's time to change something. The evening passed strangely. I tried to return to normal life as if nothing had happened, but everything felt different. Not as it once was. The morning is always a new beginning, but this time it didn't bring that sense of freshness I'm used to feeling. My daughter, as always, appears in the kitchen late, her hair tousled, her face showing complete indifference to everything around her. She nods at me, as if we're exchanging insignificant phrases, and sits at the table. She's silent. I'm silent. Again, this invisible barrier between us. It's as if she's in a different world, and I can't enter it. She's not looking for connection. She doesn't need support. She simply exists. And I try to find something alive in this morning, but all I feel is cold. Jason is silent too, but his presence is much stronger. He sits at the table, makes a few comments, but doesn't try to fill the silence with conversation. He's just there. His eyes, his calmness. It makes me feel helpless. I think again about how he's become an adult, how he's no longer the person he once was. But there's no judgment in his gaze, no guilt. He simply sits as if nothing has changed, and that makes me even more uncomfortable. Now it's just the two of us for breakfast. His words again. It's as if he's playing with this emptiness, with the fact that his place is here, but his words sound like an echo of something I've already understood long ago. My husband is gone. The children aren't here, and it's just the two of us left in this house, where once there was so much life, and now I can't understand what remains of that life. I feel the gap growing. We're sitting at the table, but each of us is lonely in our own way. I notice how Jason looks at me again, but no longer with the same look he had before. His gaze has become heavier now, filled with questions to which I can't provide answers. It's strange, and so frightening. We all sit together, but it seems that in reality, we are all different. All our silences, all these movements, they create a barrier that isn't visible, but it's felt in the air. And each of us feels it. But no one dares to break the silence. My daughter finishes her breakfast and leaves without a word. Jason continues sitting, and I realize that his silence is becoming an even more obvious reminder. It's as if he doesn't want to speak, but at the same time, he doesn't leave. His words, just the two of us, sharpen that feeling of disconnection. It seems like I'm here. He's here and everything should be fine. But in reality, nothing is fine. We are both strangers. Time dragged on slowly as I sat and watched Jason unhurriedly lifting his cup, bringing it to his lips with that calm confidence that he perhaps had lacked before. It was as if he was completely at ease here, in this house, at this table. And that amazed me. I didn't know why, but it felt as though he was now so much more than just a stepson. He was becoming something greater, something that transcended the familiar roles we were used to. I tried not to look at him, but his gaze kept catching mine. My eyes would briefly meet his, and I felt something strange growing inside me. He wasn't intrusive. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. He didn't force conversations, but there was something magnetic about his silent presence. It was as if he knew that I needed more than I was willing to admit to myself. And that was strange. I wished he wouldn't notice these fluctuations in my mood. But he did. With every look, I could feel those unspoken questions rising within me. Questions he wasn't asking aloud, but were becoming impossible to ignore. Something in the silence between us was becoming clearer. He saw something I was trying to hide. And no matter how I smiled or how I said everything was fine, his gaze was like a mirror in which I began to see myself. Not as I wanted to be. It was as if he could read my thoughts. And I didn't like it. When I returned to cooking, he said something that pierced right through me. You often think about what you should do for others, but you never ask yourself who's taking care of you. Those words hit their mark exactly. I froze. It was as if they had slipped from his lips, something long hidden. I hadn't expected to hear it, and perhaps I wasn't ready for it. But there was something important in them. He was talking about how I always put others first. He was talking about how I forgot myself. I tried to say something in response, but my words got stuck in my throat. I didn't know what to say. He saw me for who I really was, and I couldn't admit it to myself. I had always been running, away from duties, from routine tasks, from my role as a mother and wife. But something in his words made me wonder, what will happen to me if I stop being everything for everyone? Who will take care of me? There was no reproach in his voice. He was simply observing how, without even realizing it, I was losing myself in my obligations. He didn't repeat his words, not giving me the chance to process them again. But in the silence that followed his statement, I felt something greater building up. It wasn't just an observation, it was a challenge. And suddenly, I understood that I wouldn't be able to avoid this conversation. I couldn't keep hiding my feelings anymore. Maybe I didn't know exactly what was missing, but with every look he gave me, I understood that something needed to change. The day didn't get any easier. It unfolded in its usual rhythm, with the same faces and repetitive actions. But something inside me was different. My hands still performed the tasks I had imposed on myself. I washed the dishes, cooked dinner, checked that everything was in order. But inside, there was emptiness. I didn't feel like the owner of this life. Everything was automatic, and with every step, I became more alien to this routine. I just wanted it all to stop. When my daughter went to her room, I was left alone with Jason. He sat at the table, and I couldn't figure out what he was thinking. His silence was insistent, like an unfinished conversation. He didn't try to distract me or break the silence, but I felt how his presence was becoming more significant. He sat nearby with a cup of tea, and his eyes occasionally rested on me. I didn't know how to react. Strangely, it was easier to be silent with him than with others. He didn't rush me, didn't force me to discuss what I didn't want to talk about. He suddenly asked, "How are you feeling?" The words slipped from his lips with such sincerity that I probably couldn't hide the truth even if I wanted to. I answered that I was fine, but his gaze didn't change. He continued to watch me, as if he could see right through me. And maybe he really did see me as I was, lost in my responsibilities, forgetting that I needed to take care of myself. He asked again, and I felt how difficult it was to talk about what was truly troubling me. He had noticed it. He had noticed how I had started filling my life only with other people's desires, only with other people's needs. He said that I always fulfilled my duties, that I always took care of others, but who would take care of me? And it felt like a hammer strike. Those words, like the tip of a knife, pierced me, and I couldn't ignore them. He was right. I had long forgotten what it was like to be myself. I had forgotten that I had my own feelings, my own desires. I tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He suggested I take a break, and I remained silent, unsure how to respond. He didn't force me to make a decision, but his suggestion, his quiet insistence that I stop and think about myself, made me reflect. I had lived for others for too long, putting their needs above my own. I had tried for too long to be everything. But who would take care of me now? I didn't answer him, but perhaps this was the moment I realized. Something had to change. I couldn't continue being in this role. I couldn't keep living in this circle of cares, obligations, and silence. And maybe Jason was the first one to notice this. The next day, everything was as usual. The morning chaos, Anna once again disappearing into her room, my husband back at work, and I, once again alone with Jason. But now something had changed. He wasn't the same as before. I couldn't ignore this small but significant shift, how he had started to perceive me differently. Perhaps it had to do with the way he'd been looking at me in the past few days, as if he understood that I could no longer remain the same. He had stopped being just the teenager living in our house. He had started to be something more. After breakfast, when my daughter left, Jason suggested a walk. Without thinking, I agreed. Even though it was something so simple, a walk in the park, it still felt like a small escape from the usual confined circle. We walked in silence, and I felt how his silence didn't weigh on me. On the contrary, it seemed to give me time to think. We walked along the path, and although nothing was happening, something was still changing. Jason suddenly began to give compliments. Subtle, almost imperceptible. But I heard them. And it was strange. Strange that he, my stepson, was now doing such things for me. But it wasn't unpleasant. On the contrary, I felt lighter. It was as though he was saying what I hadn't heard in so long. He saw me, and in that, there was something important, because I had long stopped seeing myself. He continued to speak softly about how difficult it was to keep up with all the responsibilities, how important it was not to forget about yourself. His words weren't loud, but they seemed to cut through the silence that had always existed between us. And sitting on a bench in the park, I began to understand that perhaps this was what I had been missing. The acknowledgement that I was also a person, that I didn't have to be solely the one who takes care of others, that I had a right to my own feelings, my own weaknesses. We sat in the park, and his presence became not just support, but an unexpected revelation. He offered to help with my bag, and I felt how this simple gesture overshadowed everything around me. It was so natural, so sincere, that I even forgot how difficult yesterday had been. He didn't ask for anything from me, didn't expect anything in return. He was simply there. And that moment, in its simplicity, became more important to me than anything else. And I suddenly realized that something inside me had begun to change. I might not have known exactly where this path would lead me, but I knew I couldn't go back. When we returned home, I was different. The heavy sense of meaninglessness that I had carried with me for so long was no longer in my heart. And although nothing had dramatically changed, I suddenly felt that I wasn't alone. It had been just a walk, but it had become a turning point for me. Jason had become the person who, without even realizing it, had opened the door to change. He had become my support, even if he didn't know it. I didn't know what the future held, but perhaps this moment, this small shift, was exactly what I had been missing. In the evening, when the house once again fell into its usual silence, I was preparing dinner, as always. My hands moved across the kitchen mechanically, but my mind was elsewhere. Thoughts wouldn't let me go. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in my life had changed. Not only because Jason had started to notice me more, but also because I was beginning to perceive myself differently. Perhaps it was this invisible change that was the first step toward freeing myself from the familiar routine. Jason entered the kitchen quietly, approached me, and offered his help. It felt so natural that I didn't even think to refuse. He didn't expect me to say anything, just began chopping vegetables, not paying attention to my confusion. His movements carried none of the tension I felt within myself. He was focused, confidently handling the small tasks, and it made me feel how much was shifting in this house. We worked in silence, but this silent labor suddenly seemed meaningful. Jason didn't say much, but his presence was like a quiet conversation. I felt that his silence didn't require me to constantly explain what I was feeling. It was such a relief, not having to explain, not having to justify myself. Just being there, working together, without words. When dinner was almost ready, Jason offered to help with my bag when I went to another room for a moment. This seemingly small gesture, yet again, overshadowed everything else. He didn't try to say unnecessary words, didn't attempt to change the mood. He simply helped. He simply was there. We sat at the table and talked about simple things, about how his day had gone, about things that needed to be done around the house, about trivial matters. But in these conversations, there was something more. We talked about how I felt lonely, about how I missed those simple conversations I had long avoided. And suddenly, even though it was just an ordinary evening, I felt that I wasn't alone. We sat at the table, and it was easier than usual. Easier because I wasn't trying to play a role. Easier because I could just be myself, without unnecessary words. Jason didn't speak much, but his silence, his sincerity in just being there, became a support for me. I hadn't expected this. I thought I would be alone in my thoughts, in my questions. But Jason showed me that you don't have to be alone to realize that it's time to move forward. He didn't demand confessions, didn't ask intrusive questions. He just was here. And that was enough. It was a moment when I realized that I could allow myself to change. And that perhaps this change would start with small, simple steps like these. With each passing day, it became clearer that something had changed. Everything that once seemed inevitable now looked different. I began to notice moments that had once been hidden behind the noise and movement of daily life. And each of these moments at some point became a small step toward the realization that I could no longer continue living the way I had before. One evening, after a long and busy day, Jason and I found ourselves in the kitchen again. He offered to help with dinner, even though I was managing fine on my own, but this time I didn't refuse. We worked in silence once more, but now there was no weight to that silence between us. Every movement he made seemed light, yet meaningful. He didn't try to fill the silence, but within that quiet was sincerity that, at some point, made me feel grounded. You're always taking care of others, but when do you start thinking about yourself? Jason suddenly said, as if it were a casual remark. His words caught me off guard again. I tried to find an excuse, but I knew deep down that they hit the mark. He saw how I was losing myself in my obligations, how I was trying to be everything for everyone and forgetting about myself. These words struck me, but there was no reproach in them. He said it softly, without judgment, as if merely stating a fact. And in that moment, I realized how long it had been since I'd heard such words. Words that didn't make you feel guilty, but, on the contrary, made you realize that you have a right to your own place in the world. Jason was almost revealing a truth to me that I had long avoided. I had forgotten about myself. Forgotten that I had my own needs, my own feelings. I could no longer hide from this. I looked at him and understood that he wasn't expecting an answer from me. He saw that I was starting to understand what had been tormenting me. And his gaze became support. It was strange. I never thought my stepson could be a pillar for me. But here and now, in this simple dinner, with his silence and quiet words, I felt something important forming between us. Not just help, not just support, but true understanding. My inner world became transparent. I began to realize that I could be weak, that I could allow myself to be imperfect. I could make mistakes. And perhaps, most importantly, I didn't have to be everything for everyone. Jason offered again to help with dinner, but I no longer felt any weight in his words. I thanked him with my gaze, saying nothing, because I suddenly understood that I could allow myself to be myself. And that was my first step toward a new life. These words, these silent moments, became the beginning of something new for me. And I realized that perhaps Jason was the person who showed me how important it is to start thinking about myself. It was so simple, but at the same time, an incredibly important realization that opened up a world of change before me. Night came quietly, as always. The house sank back into its familiar silence, but this time, that silence wasn't empty to me. Everything around seemed familiar, but I could no longer ignore that something important was happening inside me. The evening passed, as usual, but I felt like I was on the threshold of something new. And this realization kept me awake. Jason's words echoed in my mind. His question, which I had been putting off for so long, his silence, full of understanding, and his support. They all grew inside me like a wave I couldn't stop. He had spoken about how I always did everything for others, but who would take care of me? It wasn't just a question. It was a challenge. A question that stirred something long forgotten, buried deep in my soul. All this time, I had been looking for answers in other people's faces, in their glances. But now I understood that all the answers were inside me. I could no longer be the woman who was always trying to please everyone while forgetting about herself. I could no longer hide my pain and fatigue. I could no longer mask my needs under the guise of caring for others. That night, I realized I couldn't keep living the way I had been. I couldn't be the woman who dedicates her life to others, forgetting about herself. I couldn't be the robot who just performs duties without asking questions. My life had become mechanical, devoid of joy, and I felt that something was being lost in that emptiness. And if I didn't take a step, if I didn't allow myself to change, I would remain stuck in this endless cycle that led nowhere good. I looked at the empty bed, the place where my husband used to lie, and I understood that his absence wasn't the only emptiness in this house. I could no longer be the one who sacrifices herself for others. I needed to return to myself. I needed to learn to be a real woman, not just a mother and wife fulfilling others' expectations. I needed change, and I was ready to embrace it. Something had to change, and I knew that moment had come. I didn't know what awaited me ahead, but now I was certain that I couldn't stay where I was. I couldn't continue being the woman I had been. Whatever happened, I was going to change. And perhaps that was the most important decision of my life.